All right, so let me introduce our speaker. And Katie, I'm going to embarrass you with all of your accolades and bio, but we have Katie O'Dunn here, and we are very excited to have her. She is a wonderful speaker and advocate for the OCD community. So I'll just tell you a little bit about her, and then I'm sure she will tell you more on her own. But Katie is an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ and founder of Stick with the Ick, which is pretty awesome. It's a virtual, inclusive interfaith community app and community for those navigating faith and OCD, offering resources across traditions. She spent 7 years as Academy chaplain and chair of religious studies at Woodward Academy in Atlanta, while consulting on interfaith programming nationwide. Katie now educates clinicians and clergy on culturally responsive treatment across religious and spiritual contexts. She leads the IOCDF Faith and OCD Action Council and consults with OCDI Texas, that's the OCD Institute of Texas, on religion and OCD. And she received Vanderbilt's Doctor of Ministry Award for distinction in integrative care practices. Not too shabby. Um, so Katie, thank you so much for being here. We're really excited. And I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ben, so much. Thank you for inviting me and for having me. And just everyone, thank you for coming to engage on a topic that I love so much and I'm passionate about. And I hope everyone here is passionate about it too. And if you're not, I hope when you leave tonight, you're like, wow, scrupulosity is really, really fun to talk about. And we're going to start by diving in, and I'll give some more introductions to kind of who I am and what I do. But I also want this to be engaging as we move through together. I will leave some time at the end for folks to pop up their hand and to ask questions. But as we move throughout, I'm also going to keep an eye on the chat. So if there's things that you're curious about or things that you want me to address, feel free to drop those in there because I want to make this as engaging for everybody as possible. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. And we will get started. Okay. So today we are talking about when faith and OCD collide, and are hoping to have an authentic conversation tonight on scrupulosity. And want to note that this presentation with the awesome OCD North Carolina, which I'm so honored again that Ben asked me to join tonight, is for individuals with OCD. Of course, our supporters are people who love them, clinicians, faith leaders, and really anybody at all who's curious about how faith and mental health intersect. Um, so in terms of background, I know Ben shared a little bit. I'm a chaplain and currently researcher who kind of sits at the intersection of faith and OCD. Currently writing a book on scrupulosity. As Ben shared, I lead a virtual community called Stick with the Ick, and I will say I see a lot of actually icksters here tonight, which is a wonderful, wonderful thing. And really just love this area. And there's the professional side, but beyond the professional side, I always like to note that um, OCD treatment very much saved my life. I am an ordained minister. I am a clinical chaplain with OCD, and I am someone who struggled with OCD without the correct treatment, without evidence-based treatment for a very long time. And in most of my journey, when I look back, I had so much shame about the things that I was experiencing. I had so much shame about the intrusive thoughts. I had shame about being in a public role and having intrusive thoughts about harm and faith and morality and my students and all sorts of different things. And I really struggled what it would look like if anybody would find out what I was experiencing. So without going too far into my story, I'll let you know that early on in my journey, I unfortunately was told when I was moving through my ordination process not to seek treatment and that nobody would respect me in ministry if I was to disclose that I was experiencing mental health struggles. And I have lots of thoughts about that now. I've worked with lots of seminary students and encouraged them actually to be open about that, to seek treatment, and that we can be amazing ministers, clergy of all traditions by seeking treatment. But because of that, I had a lot of shame. And moving through many years as an academy chaplain to 2,700 students, I didn't want anybody to know. And I ultimately hit rock bottom with the loss of some of my students to their own mental health struggles and blamed myself in really intense ways. And OCD latched on to every aspect of it. And then for the first time, I was able to get treatment. Now, at the time, I was doing intensive treatment before. I always say before that was really virtual in common ways. This was prior to COVID. Found someone who would do intensive treatment with me at night so that nobody knew virtually while I was in my role. And I got better. I started to feel like me for the first time in a very long time. And I didn't want to be quiet about my experience anymore because of my students from so many different faith backgrounds that were just as scared as I was to share about their mental health. And students that were so fearful that, well, if they got support for their mental health, could they still engage in their faith traditions? And I wanted people to know that they could. And that has become my work and my life. I fell in love with scrupulosity work. And all of the work that I do now very much is inspired by the students and the young people that I worked with that I will say honestly shared their stories before I felt comfortable sharing my story. And so I'm excited to get to share about those students and about different faith backgrounds here tonight. So, getting into OCD, I always like to just start so that we have some shared terms, some shared knowledge. And for those of you who have heard me speak before, you might be familiar with me talking about OCD as ice cream. And I always say that OCD is really gross, nasty ice cream that happens to come in a lot of different artificial flavors. All the same OCD, just a lot of gross flavors made up of artificial stuff. And it might taste a little different if it's kind of gross strawberry or, whatever it is, but it's all the same thing. It's about obsessions and compulsions. It's about obsessions or these intrusive thoughts about the things that are literally the most important to us. And it's about compulsions to try to alleviate the discomfort that comes up. Um, Now, I'll say that for a long time, I tried to kind of separate out the ice cream in my own life. And I felt like, well, if I have kind of harm related flavors over here, that has to be different from religious related flavors over here, has to be different from moral flavors over here. And it feels different. But I think there's something that's really, at least for me, liberating about recognizing it's all different aspects of that same gross OCD ice cream. And with that, shares that same OCD cycle. I always say we have the obsession, that initial intrusive thought about the thing that we care about the most, followed by some level of discomfort, which many of y'all know, whether you're an individual with OCD, clinician, or family member, that can come in the form of anxiety, but it can also come in a lot of other forms, especially when we're talking about scrupulosity. That can come in the form of guilt or shame or disgust. And compulsions are things that we're using to alleviate that guilt, shame, fear, anxiety, disgust. And those can come in the forms of things that are very physical or potentially things that are mental that we'll talk about tonight. And often someone will initially experience some temporary relief. I will say that I did. And then that cycle starts all over again. And we never really are able to get back to that same relief that we constantly seek. And it ends up just keeping us on this cycle of trying to get rid of the discomfort. And unfortunately, just getting more and more caught in the stickiness that is this gross OCD ice cream as it continues to melt all over us. So, what is scrupulosity? Well, scrupulosity is one flavor of this nasty OCD ice cream that has to do with faith and morality. So I always say it's the gross flavor that relates to the things really that we believe about the world, that we believe about God or about the divine, that we believe about purpose or about who we are. And scrupulosity, interestingly enough, is actually not a new phenomenon in religious communities. Long before we thought about this is something related to OCD. Actually, most religious and spiritual communities have historical documents that talk about scrupulosity, where we have early religious founders who, in different spaces, were either beating themselves up for not doing things correctly, or were holding themselves to this high standard above what everyone else in the community was doing. But of course, more recently, we've recognized this as a form of OCD. But I always love to look historically at even what the word scrupulosity means. So, scrupulosity comes from the Latin word scrupulum, which means small, sharp stone. And I always imagine it as this little tiny stone at the bottom of our shoe. And I don't know about y'all, but I'm a runner. And when I get a little stone in my shoe, if I kind of don't pay attention to it, if I don't give it a whole lot of energy, I'll keep running and it won't be that big of a deal. But if I start thinking about, oh man, I wish I could reach down and pull this thing out right now. That thing's feeling really itchy. Man, this is really getting into my sock. It feels bigger and bigger and bigger than the pebble started out feeling. And I always imagine it kind of that same way with scrupulosity. This little small sharp stone that the more we pay attention to it and engage with it, kind of becomes this huge boulder in our shoe. And I will note, I guess, before we keep going here, that with scrupulosity, whether we're talking about moral or religious forms, it can intersect with so many different types of OCD. I know I've let y'all know already that I really feel like OCD comes in every flavor under the sun. It also comes with swirls and different toppings. So I'll often have folks reach out to me and say, well, I have religious scrupulosity, but I kind of have this harm thing over here too. And so often it really does intersect where we see everything theme coming together, but especially with Scroop, because we know that faith is so important to people, that morality is so important to people. So it's going to intersect with all sorts of different themes related to the things that are the most important to you. So that brings us to the biggest question I get related to scrupulosity from folks, which is, but why am I stuck on this? I'll often have folks reach out and say, I would be okay stuck on anything else in the entire world except this thing right here, except this thing related to my faith, related to God, related to my religion, related to who I am as a person. And I always want folks to know that is precisely why you are stuck on this right now, or why your client is stuck on this, because you don't want to be. OCD latches onto the stuff that's the most important to you. So the theme that you're on is going to be really the most repulsive thing you could possibly imagine about the things that you care about most. And I'm going to give some examples about what this looks like in religious and spiritual traditions. I live and breathe scrupulosity. I run Scroop groups all day long, and I will get off groups pretty much on a daily basis and have a message from someone that says, but nobody talked about this particular thing. So I think I am totally the only one that has experienced this ever. And it has never been something that it's only been the one person that's experienced ever. But often it's something that feels really scary or really shameful. It might be thoughts around harm and deities or religious figures. It might be thoughts around sexuality or sexual acts in religious figures. And I want you to know that whatever that is, there is no shame in any of this. OCD is just stuck on it because it's what you care about. Um, I want to name a couple examples of what this looks like. Oh, I'm seeing a comment here just to kind of keep up with these two. Yeah, this is so common. Am I a good enough person to get into a relationship? Those I see often relationship OCD and scrupulosity and all of these different things kind of come together. Or even one of the things I've seen really recently with folks is thoughts around, well, am I allowed to be in this particular relationship with my partner because we might not share the same faith or because we have these different moral backgrounds, and OCD can kind of get into there. So yeah, relationship OCD and Scroop can absolutely intersect. So I want to name this is not an exhaustive list. So if folks are here tonight and they're looking for their theme on this list and you don't see it, that is okay because our brains can come up with anything. These just happen to be some of the things that I see the most frequently across traditions. And if you're familiar with these religious and spiritual traditions, you'll notice that all of these things relate to tenets of the faith. And so in Hinduism, what if I pronounced the shlokas incorrectly? What if I wasn't fully engaged when performing prayer or puja or my rituals? Well, what if I've done something that impacts my karma or impacts my progress in dharma? In Buddhism, what if I didn't have pure intention alongside that action? What if I have negative karma? Or what if it isn't possible to stop suffering? In Judaism, so many, but often hear things related to what if I've broken a religious law? What if I'm not fasting appropriately or appropriately following dietary restrictions? What if I broke the Sabbath rules? Or what if I wasn't fully resting on the Sabbath? In Christianity, again, so many different forms here, but I often hear across Protestant and Catholic traditions, what if I committed blasphemy against the Holy Spirit? And we'll get into this in a little bit, but there's often when I talk to individuals about what that really means within their faith, it's very different from the things that OCD is kind of asking them about. Often we with OCD kind of get stuck on theologies that might not necessarily even align with the things that are a part of our tradition. What if I gave my soul to Satan? What if I'm doomed for hell? I mean, anything that's big and final and scary. In Islam, what if I need to repeat the prayer cycle after losing count? What if I didn't clean myself properly after going to the bathroom before Friday prayer? What if I missed a spot? And in non-theism, even if we're thinking about in atheist and agnostic communities or humanist communities, I often hear, well, what if I'm wrong in my beliefs? What if everyone thinks I'm a bad person? And sometimes, even in this category, I'll see individuals going to religious leaders just to make sure that they aren't wrong about not engaging with those particular faith traditions. Oh, I see some more good questions popping up here. We'll loop back to some of these at the end, but I'm going to kind of flag all of these. So feel free to keep loading questions as we go too. So these are just a few examples, and I do want to mention as we're talking about this that we are in the midst of some beautiful, awesome holy days and religious observances right now across many traditions too. And that is something really beautiful. It's also something really challenging for individuals with OCD. So y'all might know sundown right now, we are heading into, for our Muslim community, the beginning of Ramadan. We're heading tomorrow into Ash Wednesday for those in our Christian community at the start of Lent as they move into Easter. And then we are just a few weeks out from Passover for those in our Jewish community. Again, all such beautiful times. And what I'll say, and kind of living and breathing this, is I have had an email inbox filled with folks saying, well, what if I get it wrong? What if I have an intrusive thought during this really holy time? Well, what if I don't fast appropriately? Well, what if I'm giving up the wrong thing for Lent? What if I'm not giving up enough? What if I don't feel holy? I mean, everything. Again, not because individuals are doing something wrong, but because it's so important. So OCD becomes really, really heightened at these particular times. So just some examples of compulsions that we often see, things like excessive prayer completed to perfection, excessive purity rituals or excessive kind of ritual washing, confession again and again to God or to a religious leader, avoidance on the other side of religious texts or religious practices, excessive displays of devotion, and even reassurance seeking, again, from religious leaders or from sacred texts. Um, and I think with this, it's really interesting if you take a look. This is not an exhaustive list again, but you can see that OCD kind of pushes individuals to two extremes. It might be engaging perfectly all the time or not engaging at all, both of which often don't align with their values and the things that are the most important to them. Now, any of these things that we can think of, I never want folks to think that I'm saying, well, this means that prayer, that purity rituals, that devotion, that talking to clergy is always compulsive, because that certainly is not the case. Just like any other aspect of OCD that we're talking about, or other manifestation of OCD, it's all about the function. It's about why we're engaging in something. So, this is pretty simplified, but I think this is sometimes a good way to start to approach it. I always say healthy, value driven faith. We say, well, this brings me joy, or this brings me meaning, this brings me connection. I want to engage in this way. I want to connect with my community in this way. Where on the OCD side, it's often, well, I feel like I have to get this right because I'm supposed to as a part of my faith. Um, Both for individuals on the OCD and the scrupulosity journey, as well as clinicians, I think it can be really important to really look at, well, what's the function of this behavior? And often when I am working I'm not a chaplain, or I am not a clinician, I'm a chaplain who works at the intersection of faith and OCD. I work on a lot of scrupulosity cases alongside clinicians. And typically the first thing I'll do when I come onto a case is kind of go through a chart with the clinician and the individual. And this, I always say, this isn't a test. This doesn't have to be perfect. This is kind of a curiosity tool. And I love to ask, well, let's list this out. What are you engaging in because it offers meaning, connection, hope, enjoyment, or genuine curiosity? Versus what are you doing from a place of fear, guilt, shame, anxiety, urgency, anything like that? And what are you unsure about? And the reason I always put the unsure piece is there are actually a lot of practices that might fall into different categories, even at different points in the day. So if we think about something really simple like prayer, if I woke up this morning and I said, ooh, I'm really excited to say this prayer and to connect with the divine or connect with my higher power because I am so pumped to go do this presentation tonight with OCD North Carolina. I would say that's pretty value driven. I'm wanting to connect. What a beautiful thing. Well, if later in the day, I'm like, well, I need to pray correctly because I didn't do that prayer right earlier. And I need to make sure that I have the exact right thoughts while I'm saying that prayer. And I need to ask God for forgiveness for everything that I possibly did wrong today so I don't totally mess up this presentation tonight with OCD North Carolina. Probably compulsive. Both prayers, there could be some similar components there, but different functions. Very, very different functions here. So when we're thinking about scrupulosity, treatment is such a beautiful, brave, faithful, value-driven thing. And yet, the biggest question that I often get from people is, well, what if treatment opposes my faith? What if treatment actually makes me less moral? What if it makes me less religious? What if I no longer want to engage because of treatment, or treatment makes me do things that oppose my faith? And I really want folks to know that it's never about intentionally opposing your faith. It's about addressing a mental health concern through evidence-based treatment, actually to reconnect with your faith. My doctoral work a few years back was actually focused on looking at evidence-based treatments like ERP as spiritual practices. And kind of the way that I approach that is, if we think about what we're doing when we have OCD, I'll speak for me, what I was doing when I had OCD. My whole life was really dedicated to worshiping OCD. It was all about trying to make OCD happy, trying to, appease OCD, trying to feel safe. And if we define a spiritual practice as anything that is challenging in an effort to reconnect with our faith, I always say treatment really does fit that bill. It is something that we're doing that's really hard, that feels really, really scary oftentimes, that gives us an opportunity to stop worshiping OCD and reconnect with our faith or our value-driven life in an authentic way. And it's like, wow, that is one of the most clear definitions of a spiritual practice. And in looking at that, I've seen so many times across traditions, whether someone is Christian or Jewish or Muslim or Buddhist or Sikh or Jain, individuals say, well, I'm really scared if I do this thing, I am not going to connect with my faith anymore. And on the other side, they realize, wait, I'm actually more connected with my faith than I was before. I'm just no longer worshiping OCD or the way that OCD tells me I'm supposed to be connected with my faith. So, in particular, I always like to say ERP, evidence-based treatments, don't oppose your faith. It actually helps you return to a healthy, value-driven version of your faith, maybe even more connective than anything you've experienced before. And I really believe that individuals can actually become more connected to the divine and to their faith practices. And I often like to ask the question, well, what if we kind of reframe the way that we see treatment instead of this scary thing that we kind of have to do because OCD is really intense? What if we see it as a journey through this kind of metaphorical wilderness and as a spiritual practice on the way back to reclaiming the beautiful life we were created to live? And I think it's really neat. And it's kind of through this spiritual language that I think we very much can apply to treatments like ERP. Now, one of the big things that folks often run into when we're talking about OCD treatment, or specifically when we're talking about ERP, are questions around uncertainty. I'll have a lot of folks say, well, I can't be uncertain about my faith. I'm not supposed to be uncertain about my faith. And I would actually, and folks are welcome to push back on me about this, I feel very passionately about this. I would actually argue kind of the opposite, that faith is all about uncertainty. And most theological understandings actually kind of put faith and uncertainty right here and let us know that uncertainty is really a part of our faith. And across traditions, without going into a huge theology lesson, y'all are more than welcome to reach out if you want me to send you 100 different books on this, because I will. But faith has always required uncertainty. And I often even tell folks that rather than at one point in my life, I considered myself to be, I spoke a lot on theology. I used to say I was a public theologian. Now I say I'm a publicly uncertain theologian. I'm a theologian who talks a lot about what it means to not be certain about a lot of things, but to still have faith and move toward that anyway. So I really believe that the embrace of uncertainty required as a part of OCD treatment can actually be compared to the beauty of uncertainty required for faith in the divine or as a part of our religious and spiritual practices. If you're familiar with Henry Nouwen, he has some beautiful work, especially in this area of uncertainty, and actually describes faith as an adventure in the unknown, an adventure in which we learn to trust the goodness of God. Um, and it's really out of his work that I've started to really talk to folks about uncertainty as something that can be really beautiful. With OCD, we often assume uncertainty is terrifying, that I'm going to walk outside tomorrow and something horrible is going to happen. And trying to flip it to what does it look like if we have some optimistic uncertainty? Maybe something more beautiful than I ever could have imagined could take place. And that again comes in many ways out of his theology. I think treatment for OCD ends up kind of taking having faith to a whole new level because we have to come to terms with the fact that no matter how many times we try to get reassurance or we try to find certainty, we might not get the checkbox or the answer that we want. But actually, radical faith, stepping into that uncertainty, can lead to freedom in big, beautiful, awesome ways. And I'm glad, okay, for folks in the chat, I'm glad you like the publicly uncertain theologian. I think it's important for us to name, and I think it's important for clergy across traditions to name. You can care so deeply about theology, and you can still say that you're not certain. Actually, was preaching a sermon this weekend on this, and I'm always a little nervous when I'm doing this in non-OCD contexts because I don't know exactly what the response will be. But I was talking about how when I went to seminary, I thought there would be this big jumbo flashing sign answering all of my questions about the world and theology and purpose and life and death. And I hate to break it to everybody here, the flashing sign did not exist. Did not find that flashing sign. Actually walked out with a lot more questions than I walked in with. But I also walked out with a lot more skills and tools to ask those questions and to dive into historical and sociological context and to really sit and grapple with uncertainty. And I think now that that's ultimately one of the most beautiful, at least for me, aspects of faith and theology, not having all the answers, but having more skills and tools to be able to ask some really beautiful questions. Um, so I wanted to share this with y'all. I have done a lot of work with our Stick with the It community, but also with the IOCDF Faith and OCD Special Interest Group for a long time. And a few years ago, when I was doing kind of research in this area, I asked a number of individuals across these groups to answer the question of what a leap of faith in treatment means to them. And I think this is such a beautiful thing, and I hope that you all resonate with this. So these are some anonymous responses I received. A leap of faith in treatment means trusting the process and knowing that it's not about the content of your thoughts. A leap of faith in treatment means you can either reach for your matches to light the way or let your eyes adjust to the dark. A leap of faith means surrendering in so many ways to trust God and my providers. A leap of faith means allowing the worst case scenarios to take a back seat to all of the beautiful possibilities ahead with God. It means to surrender to a higher power, to God, to uncertainty, or simply to life. A leap of faith in treatment means that even when everything in you is screaming that it's unsafe, you trust your values to guide you through, and this leads to freedom. A leap of faith means that even when the darkness of OCD surrounds me, if I keep pushing, I will find the light. It means doing religious practices out of joy instead of fear. And it means having faith in my treatment team, faith in evidence-based treatments for OCD, and faith in my own capacities for growth and learning. And I think hearing this from community, I mean, it's such just a beautiful reflection of this. And I promise I did not tell any of these individuals to share this. This really can be something beautiful that we really are taking a leap of faith in treatment. And just to give some examples across religious and spiritual traditions, Rabbi Noah Tile, who I do a lot of work with, said that ERP in the Jewish tradition specifically, he says, what a spiritual thing. It's a spiritual practice. This ERP is just the practicing, applying faith. And I always think that's a really neat thing to think of it as an application of faith. Caitlin Claggett Woods, who does a lot of work in Catholic communities, says that treatment is actually an exercise of practicing trusting God. And Mubina Mirza, who does a lot of work within our Muslim communities, really lays out this idea that ERP can be sensitive to a person's belief system and can actually help them reconnect with their faith in beautiful ways. And I will give a shout out to her that she is doing some really beautiful work with folks as Ramadan begins right now to make sure that they can engage with their faith in ways that are beautiful and authentic to them. So, with this, I often get the question both from clinicians and from individuals with OCD. Well, then how do we figure out this whole exposure thing? What's too much? What's not enough? And for individuals here, I hope you are getting all of the amazing resources from OCD North Carolina to be able to connect with a trained and licensed provider near you to really develop a hierarchy as a part of your exposures. But I also like to lay out both for clinicians and folks with OCD, that again, it's really not about opposing your faith. And I think that's often a big fear. I get multiple emails a week saying, like, if I start treatment, does this mean my provider is going to ask me to go against my faith? And it's just not the case. So for providers, I often say when you're creating culturally responsive exposures, I encourage you to really ask your clients what is meaningful to them, to try to learn about their religious and spiritual traditions. If you aren't familiar, I want you to know you don't have to be an expert in that particular faith tradition. It's also why we have clergy here who do this work, and it's possible to connect with clergy. Y'all can always reach out to me. I will send you resources galore. But it can be a really beautiful opportunity actually to ask your client what's meaningful to you, and more specifically, what do others do within your community? How do others engage on this particular topic? Now, that kind of fits in with the 80-20 rule. When we're thinking about exposures, we're often thinking, well, what would 80% of individuals in the congregation be willing to engage in? What would 80% of the folks around you be interested in doing in order to reconnect with their faith and with their life? And that also kind of relates to this idea of normative practice. We're often looking at not just within Christian communities as a whole or Jewish communities as a whole, but within your particular community, what's normative? How are other people engaging? Well, how often are folks praying or going to confession or ritually washing? When we're thinking about exposures, I also like to bring up the idea of discomfort versus disrespect, especially for clinicians here who might be fearful of making folks uncomfortable around religious exposures. It's one of the biggest questions I get in trainings where I'll have clinicians say, "Well, I'm really scared to ask someone to do something because I don't want to make them uncomfortable about their faith." And discomfort is absolutely okay. This is something that we want, right? This is a part of the process to individuals getting better. And I often think there's this kind of line that we can walk between discomfort and disrespect. And we never want to cross into something that's directly opposing someone's faith. But I really trust, like the clinicians who are on here tonight who care so deeply about this work, the navigation of that. And one of my favorite questions to ask people to kind of figure this out is why don't you want to engage in this exposure? And the reason I say why don't you is I have never heard of a good exposure that someone was really excited to engage in. When I was doing ERP in my own life, I never walked into treatment and said, "Ooh, I am so pumped about getting really, really anxious today." So probably not going to be that. But the why don't we want to engage in it becomes really important. If the why is because I'm fearful that something bad's going to happen or that God's going to be upset with me, probably a good exposure. But if it's no one else in my community would engage in this and it goes directly against my doctrines or my beliefs, that might be something that we should reassess or talk to clergy or kind of look at. But I always think that question can be really helpful, and it's something that you can even navigate for clinicians directly with your clients. Now, when we're thinking about ERP as a whole, I'll often have folks say, and I do want to note if this language doesn't resonate with folks here, that is completely okay. I know we have folks here across traditions that might have different language for God or for the divine or for a higher power. But across traditions, I'll often tell folks that if we really believe, and really most traditions believe that God is all powerful, all knowing, and all loving, and if we believe that, I really believe that we also believe that God can handle our exposures during ERP or during treatment. So I always say if God is all knowing, then God fully understands the significance of ERP or of treatment in your recovery journey. If God is all loving, then God fully supports and cares for you as you move through really tough aspects of treatment. And if God is all powerful, then God is big and strong enough to handle exposures that might seem really scary to you in these tough moments. So this language again might feel a little bit Christocentric, but I always like to kind of talk about the recovery trinity across traditions, that it's possible for individuals of different faiths. God gets an advanced copy of the DSM. Yeah. I love comments. The recovery trinity, I often think of as faith in the divine or faith in God, faith in something beyond yourself, faith in your treatment team and those people around you that are supporting you, your evidence-based treatment, handing over the keys sometimes to that team. And finally, faith in yourself, which I'll say for individuals with scrupulosity, moral or religious, is often one of the more challenging things. That faith in yourself piece, the faith to be able to handle all that we're experiencing and to lean into treatment, I think becomes so important. Now, specifically, when we're talking about faith in those around us, that is often our treatment team. And that can also be our family members. And that can also be clergy, particularly when we're talking about scrupulosity. And as kind of a general scrupulosity talk tonight, I did want to let folks know what the role of clergy can be in this process. And I think that this can be a really beautiful thing to recognize that faith leaders and family members can be a part of this process alongside treatment, where, of course, it's so important for someone to be in treatment with a licensed provider. Um, but clergy, I often say, can really come in and help offer support without reassurance. And either for the individual with OCD, the clinician or the family member to talk to the clergy member who's kind of involved and to explain OCD, to explain OCD treatment, and to let them know how they can be there to offer support without reassurance can be really beautiful. I want folks here with OCD tonight to know if you are going to talk to your clergy member about it, this does not mean you have to tell them every aspect of your intrusive thoughts. I see this come up often where it's like, I need to confess, they need to know every little thing. You can share as much or as little as you feel comfortable with. That's okay. But I often think the most helpful thing is utilizing clergy and their expertise to explore the scope of really your faith tradition, what this actually looks like, what's normative for others in your community around these particular themes, to let them know how they can offer motivation through meaning and acceptance. And what I mean by those things, I think it can be really beautiful for clergy through their different lenses to walk with individuals through the emotions that they're experiencing, not so much through the content. So I always say we can kind of stay away from the content, but clergy or family members can sit alongside individuals who are experiencing guilt or shame or fear or anxiety and can really say, well, hey, I am with you in the midst of this, and can even refer to different aspects of scripture and their theologies of others sitting in the midst of those really difficult and challenging emotions as a part of these leaps of faith. Just a couple more pieces I wanted to at least get to share. I'll be brief with this for folks because I do want to get to questions. Um, Prayer across traditions can look so many different ways for individuals, but one of the biggest questions that I often get is, well, how do I pray in a non-OCD way, especially as I'm moving through recovery? And what I like to encourage folks to do with that is, of course, thinking about the function of why we're praying, going back to what does it mean to connect from a space of meaning and connection and hope, as opposed to fear and guilt and shame and anxiety. But I wanted to give just two examples that you might be able to apply across traditions in ways that are meaningful to you. So if you are familiar with the Serenity Prayer, this is actually an adaptation of the Serenity Prayer through the lens of acceptance and commitment therapy. And it's one of my favorite things. This is in an awesome book called Act for Clergy and Pastoral Counselors. One of my mentors helped to write this and put this together alongside Steve Hayes. And I think this is a really just beautiful opportunity to lean into acceptance as prayer. And it's written as, let me give my permission for life to be as I find it, even though I may not approve of what I find. I have wisdom to see what would be good to change, willingness to act, willingness to follow through, and the gratitude for the opportunity to try and live my life as best I can. And I can share if folks are interested in kind of where to find these things, I can share that after too. This is a little bit of a different style that can also be adopted across faith traditions. But I will often use something like this with individuals who are struggling not to ask God for reassurance, struggling not to confess, or struggling not to ask God to take away OCD in a way that's really compulsive. And I think so many of us, if there are folks on here with scrupulosity tonight, you've probably had the experience. Okay, I see head nods. You've probably had the experience at some time of saying, well, God, just please take away this intrusive thought. Could I just not have these thoughts anymore? Right. And unfortunately, we know that that becomes compulsive because the more we don't want to have the thoughts, the more intense they become. So rather, I encourage folks to really ask for support to lean into treatment. So in this form, it says, God, please give me the strength to lean into discomfort and sit with uncertainty. It feels hard and scary, but I know you're walking alongside me. Please give me the courage to use my tools as I offer myself compassion and truly live into my treatment, always moving toward the beautiful life you've created for me. Amen. Again, that can kind of be adapted across traditions. But as we finish up, I wanted to kind of close out with two different pieces with big, scary questions and important, meaningful questions. So these are the questions that I see the most often or that I'll have forwarded from clinicians. And that kind of folks are consistently asking that feel big and scary. And I want you to know when I'm saying big and scary, it's not because they actually are big and scary. It's because OCD makes them feel really big and scary and like they have razor sharp teeth and all sorts of things. So the first is, does ERP oppose my faith? Or more generally, does treatment oppose my faith? And I want to give a big, loud shout from the rooftops. No, it doesn't. It's actually something that can help you reconnect with your faith in a beautiful, authentic, value driven way. Often it's actually not engaging in treatment that OCD will separate you from your faith, not the other way around. I'll often have folks also ask, well, what if my therapist doesn't share my faith? And there are lots of different perspectives on this, but you might be surprised to find out that I am a minister who tells folks it is okay if your therapist doesn't share your faith. OCD is a mental health issue. It's not a faith issue. So, kind of like I'm not necessarily going to walk into my heart surgery and say, okay, is my cardiologist from the same denomination? That isn't going to be my top priority. I want it to be somebody who really knows OCD, who treats OCD, who understands OCD. And I always say that's the primary piece. Of course, it can be beautiful if you share traditions, but there's other opportunities too for clergy. This is a lot of the work I do and that my team does to come on and really support with the faith pieces alongside treatment. You do not need to necessarily work with someone who shares your faith background. It's all about the treatment pieces. And finally, will treatment separate me from the divine? And what if getting better makes me less religiously observant? Now, I'll always want to leave a little room for uncertainty here because I know if I tell you absolutely no, OCD will poke a hole in it and say she doesn't know what she's talking about, and who knows? So who knows? But what I will tell you, just based on the work that I've done and what I've seen, is that I often see the opposite. I see folks stepping toward their faith in ways that are significantly more beautiful and more authentic to them than they were previously. So I like to then sometimes reframe these from big, scary questions to some different, important, meaningful questions to reflect back. And the first, for maybe folks here to reflect on in their own lives, is to think about how might engaging in treatment help you return to a value-driven version of your faith? Or for clinicians to ask your clients, how might it help you return to a value-driven version of your faith? If another person was feeling shame or guilt in the face of the divine, how might you respond to them? And could you offer that same response to yourself? Now, I know we didn't get into this a ton tonight, but self-compassion for folks with scrupulosity is rough. Y'all, it is so rough. And they tend to be the most wonderful, amazing, just individuals. And every time I ask someone this question, they say, well, of course, I would be so nice to someone else. And of course, God doesn't hold them to that standard. And of course, they don't have to be perfect. But I think it can be a big exposure to try to offer that same thing to yourself and to try to see yourself through the same loving lens through which the divine sees you or that you believe the divine sees others. And finally, does the way you worship the divine actually align with how you view the divine? And what I mean by this, because this I know can feel a little bit tricky, is often OCD will distort theologies. So a lot of times I'll talk with folks who say, well, I'm really scared of this thing, but this actually isn't what I believe, and it actually isn't what my tradition believes. And that can be a really good sign that it's OCD. And for instance, I'll talk with folks often who are really fearful that God is going to, right now in this moment, punish them because they have done something quote unquote wrong. And I'll often say, is that really a part of your tradition? Do you believe that God is kind of waiting for you to do something wrong to punish you? And most of the time, folks will say, no, but OCD says it. And it's really convincing. So I want to do this thing just to make sure. It's like, does this actually align with what we believe about God? Um, so I think all of these these things can be really beautiful ways to start to reframe. And as we think about scrupulosity, I will wrap up because I want folks to be able to ask questions. But as we think about scrupulosity, whether it's moral or religious, I want folks to know that there really is so much hope. And that for those of you who are experiencing this right now, I have been there. I have been with you in the thick of it. And I really believe that by leaning in and engaging in treatment, it isn't going to remove you from your faith or who you are. It's going to help you step even more fully and beautifully towards your life. And there's so much hope in that.